We are following some breaking news out of the nation's capital. One Capitol police officer and a suspect are dead after a vehicle rammed into a barricade on Capitol Hill. The suspect was killed by officers when he got out of the vehicle and lunged at them with a knife. A second officer is in the hospital. Their identities are not known at this time. Capitol Police described the incident at a press conference earlier.
The suspect did start lunging toward U.S. Capitol Police officers, at which time U.S. Capitol Police officers fired upon the suspect. At this time, the suspect has been pronounced deceased. 2 U.S. Capitol Police officers were transported to 2 different hospitals, and it is with a very, very heavy heart that I announce one of our officers has succumbed to his injuries. This has been an extremely difficult time for U.S. Capitol Police after the events of January 6th and now the events that have occurred here today. So I ask that you keep our U.S. Capitol Police family in your thoughts and prayers.
For more on this, I want to bring in CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge. Catherine, describe where you are right now.
Well, Tom, I want to set the scene. Right now, our crew is here at Constitution and First. If you're familiar with Washington, D.C., and you've been to Capitol Hill, just up the hill behind me is the Capitol complex. And then about 100 yards in this direction is the mall itself. As you just heard at that news conference, the suspect was driving up Constitution, was driving behind me, and then encountered these metal barricades. These are fixed barricades in the roads. They've been in place really almost immediately after 9/11 for security purposes. They rammed the barricades and then also injured those 2 Capitol Hill police officers. As you heard from authorities, the suspect brandished a weapon, which we now know is a knife, and then they were shot. That vehicle has now been cleared, and based on our reporting here at CBS News, they did not find any evidence of explosives in that vehicle, Tom.
A very dramatic series of events unfolding on Capitol Hill today. What do we know more about that suspect, Catherine?
Well, we really just have, Tom, the most basic information about the suspect at this time. What we heard from authorities a short time ago is that they believe this individual was acting alone. They are not anticipating any change to the security posture or no immediate change to the security posture here on Capitol Hill. They also said the suspect was not known to law enforcement. That means this was not somebody who was on some kind of watch list because of previous actions or statements they had taken. And they also said it does not appear that terrorism was a factor in this case. Tom.
As we heard from the police officer in that press conference, she started to get emotional when she mentioned that they had lost one of their own. Can you talk to us about what we know about the police officers at this moment and also just the broader picture of how devastating this must be for that police force?
Well, Tom, I've been covering Capitol Hill here in Washington, D.C. For the better part of a decade, and I've passed through these checkpoints like so many journalists over the years, and you really come to develop a very personal relationship with some of these officers. Not that you know their name or their backstory or their families, but you come to recognize them, and they're a very welcoming presence on Capitol Hill. But the dynamic has really changed in the last 3 months. What's clear from a recent watchdog report that we told you about on CBSN recently is that this is a security force that was just not postured for violence on January 6th. So it's a shock to the system because so many people come through the building behind me, whether it's journalists or lawmakers or just everyday people. It's the ease with which people can go through that facility that really has made it the people's house. And that's why the strict security in the last several months, I think, has been very, very difficult for many people to stomach. On to the investigation. I can tell you from my experience working in this area for 2 decades that the police and law enforcement will first start to comb through the vehicle the suspect was driving for what they call pocket litter. That's pieces of information, even pieces of paper, a rental agreement, for example, the registration that will help them identify who this individual is and where they're from. Did he have or she have any identification on them that can support that law enforcement research? And finally, they're going to start going back through their databases to see if there was something they missed about this individual. Because what we've learned since January 6th is that there are two buckets that law enforcement is looking at. They're looking at kind of organized groups or small conspiracies who are communicating, online through social media about their shared ideologies. And sometimes, as we saw on January 6th, their shared plans to commit acts of violence. The other bucket, which is the most problematic bucket, are what they call lone actors or individuals who aren't really part of a conspiracy and stay way below the radar. And if you think about the post-9/11 period, we saw this with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, with Americans who became radicalized by that ideology. This is really the same template that law enforcement is trying to get their arms around: individuals who are primed to commit acts of violence, but they're so beneath the radar and they're not involved with anyone else that you cannot intercept their communications to even have the most basic tip that they may be plotting or committing an act in the very near future, Tom.
Still lots of ground to cover in this investigation. Catherine Herridge, thank you for your insight.
You're welcome.